The Battle of Hampton Roads, often referred to as either the Battle of the Monitor and Merrimack or the Battle of Ironclads, was the most noted and arguably most important naval battle of the American Civil War from the standpoint of the development of navies. It was fought over 2 days, March 8–9, 1862, in Hampton Roads, a roadstead in Virginia where the Elizabeth and Nansemond rivers meet the James River just before it enters Chesapeake Bay adjacent to the city of Norfolk. The battle was a part of the effort of the Confederacy to break the Union blockade, which had cut off Virginia's largest cities, Norfolk and Richmond, from international trade. The major significance of the battle is that it was the first meeting in combat of ironclad warships, i.e., the US Monitor and the Css Virginia. The Confederate fleet consisted of the ironclad ram Virginia and several supporting vessels. On the first day of battle, they were opposed by several conventional, wooden-hulled ships of the Union Navy. On that day, Virginia was able to destroy 2 ships of the Federal flotilla, US Congress and US Cumberland, and was about to attack a third, US Minnesota, which had run aground. However, the action was halted by darkness and falling tide, so Virginia retired to take care of her few wounded, which included her captain, Flag Officer Franklin Buchanan, and repair her minimal battle damage. Determined to complete the destruction of the Minnesota, Catesby Ap Roger Jones, acting as captain in Buchanan's absence, returned the ship to the fray the next morning, March 9. During the night, however, the ironclad Monitor had arrived and had taken a position to defend Minnesota. When Virginia approached, Monitor intercepted her. The 2 ironclads fought for about 3 hours, with neither being able to inflict significant damage on the other. The duel ended indecisively, Virginia returning to her home at the Gosport Navy Yard for repairs and strengthening, and Monitor to her station defending Minnesota. The ships did not fight again, and the blockade remained in place. The battle received worldwide attention, and it had immediate effects on navies around the world. The preeminent naval powers, Great Britain and France, halted further construction of wooden-hulled ships, and others followed suit. A new type of warship was produced, the Monitor, based on the principle of the original. The use of a small number of very heavy guns, mounted so that they could fire in all directions, was first demonstrated by Monitor, but soon became standard in warships of all types. Shipbuilders also incorporated rams into the designs of warship hulls for the rest of the century. The blockade at Norfolk. On April 19, 1861, shortly after the outbreak of hostilities at Charleston Harbor, U.S. President Abraham Lincoln proclaimed a blockade of ports in the seceded states. On April 27, after Virginia and North Carolina had also passed ordinances of secession, the blockade was extended to include their ports also. Even before the extension, local troops seized the Norfolk area and threatened the Gosport Navy Yard in Portsmouth. The commandant there, Captain Charles S. Macaulay, though loyal to the Union, was immobilized by advice he received from his subordinate officers, most of whom were in favor of secession. Although he had orders from Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles to move his ships to northern ports, he refused to act until April 20, when he gave orders to scuttle the ships in the yard and destroy its facilities. 9 ships were burned, among them the screw frigate US Merrimack. 1 was towed away successfully. Merrimack burned only to the waterline, however, and her engines were more or less intact. The destruction of the Navy Yard was mostly ineffective. In particular, the large dry dock there was relatively undamaged and soon could be restored. Without firing a shot, the advocates of secession had gained for the South its largest Navy Yard, as well as the hull and engines of what would be in time its most famous warship. They had also seized more than 1,000 heavy guns, plus gun carriages and large quantities of gunpowder. With Norfolk and its Navy Yard in Portsmouth, the Confederacy controlled the southern side of Hampton Roads. To prevent Union warships from attacking the yard, the Confederates set up batteries at Sewell's Point and Craney Island, at the juncture of the Elizabeth River with the James. The Union retained possession of Fort Monroe, at Old Point Comfort on the Virginia Peninsula. They also held a small man-made island known as the Rip Raps, on the far side of the channel opposite Fort Monroe, and on this island they completed another fort, named Fort Wool. With Fort Monroe went control of the lower peninsula as far as Newport News. Forts Monroe and Wool gave the Union forces control of the entrance to Hampton Roads. The blockade, initiated on April 30, 1861, cut off Norfolk and Richmond from the sea almost completely. To further the blockade, the Union Navy stationed some of its most powerful warships in the roadstead. There, they were under the shelter of the shore-based guns of Fort Monroe and the batteries at Hampton and Newport News, and out of the range of the guns at Sewell's Point and Craney Island. For most of the first year of the war, the Confederacy could do little to oppose or dislodge them. Birth of the Ironclads. When steam propulsion began to be applied to warships, naval constructors renewed their interest in armor for their vessels. Experiments had been tried with armor during the Crimean War, just prior to the American Civil War, and the British and French navies had each built armored ships and were planning to build others. In 1860, the French Navy commissioned La Gloire, the world's first ocean-going ironclad warship. Great Britain followed a year later with HMS Warrior. The use of armor remained controversial, however, and the United States Navy was generally reluctant to embrace the new technology. Css Virginia. When the Civil War broke out, Confederate Secretary of the Navy Stephen R. Mallory was an early enthusiast for the advantages of armor. As he looked upon it, the Confederacy could not match the industrial North in numbers of ships at sea, so they would have to compete by building vessels that would be individually superior to those of the Union. The edge would be provided by armor. Mallory gathered about himself a group of men who were able to put his vision into practice, among them John M. Brooke, John L. Porter, and William P. Williamson. When Mallory's men searched the South for factories that could build engines to drive the heavy ships that he wanted, they found no place to do it immediately. At the best facility, the Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond, building engines from scratch would take at least a year. Upon learning this, Williamson suggested taking the engines from the hulk of Merrimack, recently raised from the bed of the Elizabeth River. His colleagues promptly accepted his suggestion and expanded it, proposing that the design of their projected ironclad be adapted to the hull. Porter produced the revised plans, which were submitted to Mallory for approval. On July 11, 1861, the new design was accepted, and work began almost immediately. The burned-out hull was towed into the graving dock that the Union Navy had failed to destroy. During the subsequent conversion process, the plans were further modified to incorporate an iron ram fitted to the prow. Her offense in addition to the ram consisted of 10 guns, 6 9-in smoothbore Dahlgrens, 2 6.4-in and 2 7-in Brooke rifles. Trials showed that these rifles firing solid shot would pierce up to 8 inches of armor plating. The Tredegar Iron Works could produce both solid shot and shell, and since it was believed that Virginia would face only wooden ships, she was given only the shell. Had solid shot been used against the Monitor, the result of the battle might have been different. The armor plating, originally meant to be 1 in thick, was replaced by double plates, each 2 in thick, backed by 24 in of iron and pine. The armor was pierced for 14 gun ports, 4 on each broadside, 3 forward, and 3 aft. The revisions, together with the usual problems associated with the transportation system of the South, resulted in delays that pushed out the launch date until February 3, 1862, and she was not commissioned until February 17. Bearing the name CSS Virginia, US Monitor intelligence that the Confederates were working to develop an ironclad caused consternation for the Union. But Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles waited for Congress to meet to request permission to consider building armored vessels. Congress gave this. permission on August 3, 1861. Wells appointed a commission, which came to be known as the Ironclad Board, of 3 senior naval officers to choose among the designs that were submitted for consideration. The 3 men were Captains Joseph Smith and Hiram Paulding, and Commander Charles Henry Davis. The board considered 17 designs, and chose to support 3. First of the 3 to be completed, even though she was by far the most radical in design, was Swedish engineer and inventor John Ericsson's Monitor. Ericsson's Monitor, which was built at Ericsson's Yard on the East River in Greenpoint, Brooklyn, incorporated new and striking design features, the most significant of which were her armor and armament. Instead of the large numbers of guns of rather small bore that had characterized warships in the past, Ericsson opted for only 2 guns of large caliber. He wanted to use 15-inch guns, but had to settle for 11-inch Dahlgren guns when the larger size were unavailable. These were mounted in a cylindrical turret, 20 feet in diameter, 9 feet high, covered with iron 8-inch thick. The whole rotated on a central spindle, and was moved by a steam engine that could be controlled by 1 man. Ericsson was afraid that using the full 30 pounds of black powder to fire the huge cannon would raise the risk of an explosion in the turret. He demanded that a charge of £15 be used to lessen this possibility. As with Virginia, it was found that the full charge would pierce armor plate, a finding that would have affected the outcome of the battle. A serious flaw in the design was the pilot house from which the ship would be conned, a small structure forward of the turret on the main deck. Its presence meant that the guns could not fire directly forward, and it was isolated from other activities on the ship. Despite the late start and the novelty of construction, Monitor was actually completed a few days before her counterpart Virginia, but Virginia was activated first.